Stretching for 26.5 million square kilometers, the Arctic ranges from highly developed areas in Norway to pristine environments in the outskirts of Canada and Greenland, and the diversity is extraordinary. It is home for close to 4 million people and the realm of interests of Russia, Canada, the United States, Denmark, and Norway. But most of all, it is undergoing enormous changes due to global warming. The Arctic holds resources, shipping routes, and military significance that will have strategic value in the decades to come, posing both risks and opportunities for the region. What does the future hold for the Arctic?
So, firstly, the melting of ice sheet on Greenland and ice cap in the Arctic Ocean rises the levels of oceans all around the globe. It does not only pose threats to local inhabitants, to local economies, the indigenous groups of people globally, because of impact of rising level of oceans has on world migration routes, economy, and so on and so forth, but it gives some advantages as well, and maybe opportunities. I mean, opening of new sea roads, making some resources more accessible, having a greater possibilities of developing, for instance, Arctic tourism. So it is not only about possible mining and polluting even more the region, but also about having tourism, when made in a sustainable way, could also contribute to local communities. So we have climate change discussed, and on the other hand, we have this so-called global competition of great powers.
Among the Arctic's key resources are hydrocarbons. It is estimated to hold 30% of gas and 13% of the global oil reserves.
Resources of the Arctic is another controversial topic in the region, since there are two approaches promoted by different groups. So on the one hand, we have political parties and lobby groups which are trying to convince governments that we should phase out heavy industry in the north, get rid of oil and gas exploitation there in order to save the planet. And on the other hand, we have strong pro-hydrocarbons lobby, which is advocating even bigger investments in these industries, saying that, first of all, we need it currently because we have energy crisis and distribution of gas and oil is of crucial importance for Europe right now, and the security of supplies has to be ensured. And another argument which is being used in that debate is that if we don't do this in liberal and democratic Norway or elsewhere in Europe, then someone else, another countries will provide this oil, which is maybe not so sustainable and eco-friendly business in the Middle East, for instance. So there is this tension, and we will see what the future will bring. We have countries like Denmark and Canada. Canada, for instance, banned new projects, offshore projects in the Arctic, speaking of oil and gas investments. Greenland and Denmark announced that they will phase out the entire extraction of oil and gas until mid-century. So there are countries which are clearly going this direction, and there are some countries which would like to sustain this industry, so Norway and US as well. Speaking of Russia, it is obvious, so like oil and gas and the Arctic is essential part of Russian economy and its natural resources capacities. For Norway itself, oil and gas is very, very important. It is around 60% of country's export. We have to remember that speaking of the investments in the Arctic itself, we are speaking of the Barents Sea. And the distribution of oil and gas fields in Norway is unequal. So the majority is located in the North Sea and Norwegian Sea, so only 2 out of 93 projects are located in the Arctic itself. The industry is very important for Norway, but the Barents Sea itself is kind of limited importance in that respect. But it is a very important ground for fisheries. At the same time, the biggest cod supplies are from this area. Norway's second biggest exporter of fish worldwide, so after China. This fishery industry is very important in the northern part of the country. It is around 8-9% of the country's export. Up to 10% of Norwegian population lives north of the Arctic Circle, so this is the only country from the Arctic region in which such a huge part of the population actually lives there, and this group is really dependent on fisheries and is feeling the pain of sanctions and this limitation of trade and cooperation with Russia at the same time.
Today, big politics is more frequently venturing into the Arctic Circle, and the region is increasingly seen as a potentially significant theater of global competition.
This is a part of the rivalry which takes place all around the world currently. So nowadays we have this paradigm of two blocks, undemocratic states against democratic ones, and we can divide this competition in many different ways, but actually in the Arctic we are seeing, of course, the competition between Russia, which wants to control its part of the region fully in economic and military means. For Russia, Arctic is a part of its great power identity as well, that we are Arctic power. Russia claims the continental shelf in the Arctic Ocean. All countries around this North Pole, Lomonosov Ridge, are claiming that this is a natural extension of their territory, so Canada, Denmark and Russia, but Russian claims are the most extensive ones. So actually they are reaching almost to the limits of the exclusive economic zones of Danish and Canadian waters. So basically Russia sees the North Pole as a part of its zone of influence and even part of its territory. In response, the Western actors tried to organize themselves better during the last decade, sometimes with better results, sometimes with slightly less good performance. But anyway, we observed a clear trend that the threat from Russia, given its increased military activities, which includes military exercises, demonstration of nuclear capabilities, flying bombers, strategic bombers along the coastline of Norway. Given that claims to North Pole, military activity, threats towards the West, it was clear that US and other NATO allies in the region should respond somehow. And this is how this military component of this rivalry has developed. And then we have China as well, which is increasingly interested in the region and defined itself as a near-Arctic state, wants to be active, not in the military way, but through trade, investments, development of infrastructure.
Chinese activity in the region is being monitored by Western countries. Its investments can be seen as beneficial for local communities, but at the same time, they can pose a threat to the interests of the main regional actors.
Yeah, so first of all, why China is interested in Arctic? I would hint at food security, fisheries. It is very important for China. Raw materials and resources. So Arctic is full of reserves of oil, gas, different rare elements. And we can add to that shipping roads as well. So China is interested in the development of Arctic sea roads and possible trade links through the Arctic to Russia and to Western Europe. And China, in my opinion, had a great window of opportunity to make more far-reaching investments in the region 20 years ago, up until actually late Obama and early Trump administration, when this shift towards the greater competition with China and anxiety regarding the affairs in East Asia started to develop. Back then, the level of awareness about, for instance, dual use of some of the Chinese investments, like civil military. So you have investments in the airport which serve people and can enhance Greenlandic tourism and transportation. But on the other hand, having a Chinese company there may lead to collecting some of the sensitive intelligence data. So the level of awareness back then was much lower. And back then it was a proper time for China to make bigger investments in the Arctic region. It was not the case, so I would say that the Chinese investments there were token investments, right, really small ones, except maybe liquefied gas and cooperation in that respect with Russia, so resources from Yamal Peninsula. This is the area which is better developed in relations between Russia and China. So I would say that China in the future will face many difficulties in expanding its presence in the Arctic. We saw already several investments being blocked in ports infrastructure or airport infrastructure. As it is being frequently discussed, a kind of solution for China and at the same time for Russia, which is after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, isolated in the Arctic, is this bilateral cooperation. So it is kind of in short-term win-win for both sides, both for Russia and China. In the long term for Russia, I'm not sure, but for China certainly. I mean, playing with China, this Arctic game for Russia is important because Russia can show to other Arctic nations, okay, if you don't want to cooperate with us, we will let others in. So we have an exclusive group of Arctic nations gathered in Arctic Council, and we are governing this region alone, we are benefiting from it, and if you don't want to cooperate with us, we will let United Arab Emirates or India or other nations which are, for instance, observers in the Arctic Council to a greater extent into Arctic affairs, with their investments, with their economic presence and shipping routes, for instance. This is the game Russia can play vis-à-vis its Arctic neighbors, threatening them with growing presence of China, and at the same time, for China, it is once again a good opportunity currently to increase its involvement in the Arctic, using this Russian isolation, lack of capital and funding for many different energy projects to simply step in and be more present in the Arctic.
The interests of Arctic nations are not uniform. While for some, the region has military significance, for others, it's a question of national identity.
Let's start with the US. So the US is not perceiving itself as an Arctic power, and it has not a kind of social background and identity as a basis for Arctic policy. We have two nations in the Arctic which are more embedded in the region, not physically only, but also in terms of identity. I mean, Norway with their Arctic explorers like Nansen on Amundsen, and Canada, which is like in their identity, they are like a true north and kind of guardian of the Arctic and northern hemisphere. It is not the case of the United States. United States have certain interest in the region, primarily military ones. So there are many things ongoing there. This is primarily designed to contain Russia militarily. In terms of China, US wants to monitor Chinese activities and jump in the cases where they think that this investment might be too much in terms of security. We have these two different approaches, military-oriented and economic-oriented, economic competition-oriented vis-a-vis China. At the same time, the US is guarding some principles there in the Arctic. So international law principles, the extraction of natural resources there has a secondary importance for the US. They have other sources of oil and gas. This is not at the forefront of this story. I would like to point to something else. I mean, this freedom of navigation rule. So this is something tremendously important for the US because they see the Arctic region as an area where there are many controversial questions in that respect, namely Northwest Passage, so these waters and Sea Road which is going through Arctic archipelago of Canada. US and other countries are considering it, recognizing it as an international strait, and Canada sees it as its historic internal waters. So this is the main approach of the US towards the Arctic. So military interest, economic interest, and defending some rules of international law. And in terms of Canada is a super interesting case in terms of Arctic because on the one hand, Canada has strong Arctic identity and is very sensitive, speaking of its sovereignty there. It was always a huge contrast in Canada's policy that on the one hand we had this strong emphasis on Arctic sovereignty and defending our rights and protection of Canadians' Arctic, and on the other hand huge gaps in defense expenditures and capabilities. So Canada had many different problems over the recent years to procure new military equipment, to open new military bases, to enhance military infrastructure in the high north, to ensure all enablers to be more present, visible, and active in the Arctic. So Canada basically has a very interesting setup of this Arctic policy, which is like stretching, maybe overstretching, from projects aims at sustainable development, protection of climate, environment, cutting emissions, reconciliation with indigenous people, which is very important for Trudeau government. And on the other hand, these military tasks related to cooperation with the US in terms of protecting the airspace and maritime areas around North America under the umbrella of NORAD command.
NATO's approach to the Arctic has been gradually changing over the past few years. It has been influenced by Russia's increasing militarization of its part of the region, concerns about its hybrid warfare in the polar areas, and uncertainty about the nature of China's involvement within the Arctic Circle.
So here we can see a rather clear division between the defense of North America and defense of Europe, although NATO is for everyone. The security guarantees, Article 5, it all covers the Arctic areas, so Greenland, Svalbard, so this autonomous part of Norway. It is there, but actually NATO has no real significant permanent military presence in the Arctic. Actually, apart from the policing, air policing mission over Icelandic skies, which is not a permanent mission, it's rotational and takes place only a couple of months a year. Plus, NATO signaled its capabilities to act on the northern flank back in 2018 during huge exercises called Trident Juncture, where the whole alliance was involved in defending Norway, central part of the country, not this Arctic part closer to Russia, to avoid provocative steps towards Russians. But generally speaking, NATO is more focused on this eastern part of the northeastern flank of the alliance. So Poland, Baltic states. Now we have Finland in. This is the area where this enhanced forward presence is established and stronger steps towards increasing security, deterrence and defense in that region. In the Arctic, we see absence of such measures. And NATO is limited in the region somehow as well by the policies of Arctic states themselves. It has been a controversial topic among the Arctic states.
The situation in the Arctic has also been affected by the full-scale Russian aggression against Ukraine, which began on February 24th, 2022.
Essentially, all the Arctic states from the western part of the Arctic recognize that there is no coming back to business as usual with Russia in the region. So after the annexation of Crimea back in 2014, the tensions between Russia and the West haven't influenced much cooperation in the Arctic. So there was this clear paradigm that Arctic is a zone of peaceful cooperation with Russia, and we should avoid conflicts there, and that it is a kind of exception in the international relations, that countries which are fighting in one region cooperate in the Arctic. And full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia was threshold or kind of triggering point for changing approach completely. So Arctic Council cooperation was suspended back in March 2022. It was very painful for Russian side because Russia held a chairmanship back then in the council. The work was suspended, but still Arctic countries perceived the Arctic Council as their great achievement and the best group for managing and governing the region. So everyone actually waited until 2023 when Norway took over the chairmanship. So this cooperation is once again unlocked, but in the areas not involving Russia. This is to show to Russians, but also to some extent to Chinese, that we cannot sustain this kind of relationship, that we compete in one region and you invade another country and we try to act like nothing happened in the Arctic. So this is the short-term prediction that Russia will remain isolated. It all depends on the development of the situation in Ukraine. But at the same time, it is impossible to sustain cooperation in the Arctic without Russia. For a simple reason, Russia controls around 50% of the region. So if we discuss issues like search and rescue, pollution control, fisheries control, shipping routes, science, environment protection, monitoring climate change. So it is impossible to have like a full picture and effective cooperation without Russia. So my prediction is that in the coming years we'll see some attempts to unlock certain areas of fields of cooperation with Russia, but at the same time having this possibly limited cooperation with Moscow, we'll see Western countries developing their capabilities and military deterrence in the region as well, simultaneously to some kind of attempts to cooperate once again.
What does the future hold for the Arctic? The scenarios are by no means determined and depend on a variety of factors.
Reading about the future of the Arctic region is one of the most interesting lectures one can pick, because there are so many different thought-provoking scenarios for the region itself, stretching really from pessimistic dystopian ones to optimistic utopian, and I think that we'll see both. So I mean, the first ones are focused more on the issue of climate change and its disaster consequences for the region, that it will influence the way of life of the people living there. So in the future, nowadays Europe is experiencing this huge migration from the east and from the south. And maybe in the future we'll see migration from the north, because it will be very hard to live there for people. About thawing of permafrost, infrastructure problems and diseases and many other phenomena which will be negative there. Plus this enhanced rivalry between great powers, which may lead not only to some military incidents in the future, but as well to the rise of, for instance, terrorism or even pirate activity there, if we see the development of shipping routes. So this is this like pessimistic vision. And on the other hand, we have some ideas and predictions that maybe everything will go good direction, and we will see countries cutting gas emissions and delivering climate agenda goals. We will see curbing the climate change, the melting, and more trade in the region, development of tourism, like the limitation of continental shelf, for instance, around the North Pole in a peaceful manner. So actually all Arctic states declared that they will use the UNCLOS, so this law of the sea convention, to manage Arctic affairs in a peaceful way. So my prediction is that we will see both. So in some areas we will see cooperation, and in others rivalry and unfortunately growing competition among countries interested in the region.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more content like this one about the region. We have new videos out every week.